Well, thank you for joining us. I am the opinion editor for the Oregonian. My name is Helen Jung, and I'm here with the candidates for House District 36.
Yep.
Right? Okay.
Great.
This is my second one today, so just wanted to make sure I got that one right. Um, with Lisa Reynolds and Laurie Wimmer. And if Lisa, if you could start off by telling us a little bit about why you're running and why you think voters should choose you.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I'm grateful for the Oregonian for this opportunity, for you, Helen, for making this happen, and thank you for Laurie for joining, of course. My name is Dr. Lisa Reynolds, and I'm a pediatrician. I'm an activist. I'm a mom, and I love the work I do. Being a pediatrician is tremendously rewarding. I feel like I'm there. Oh, I'm so sorry. I feel like I'm there at some of the most special times in patients' lives. And I've been reflecting over the last few weeks when I go and see newborns at the hospital and how different it is now than it was before COVID. I mean, I used to go in the room and there'd be grandparents and aunts and uncles and bags of food, and it's all a bit more quiet and subdued. Still wonderful, still the most amazing day in this family's life. But I realize how much is being lost and missed by not having the grandparents there, and the grandparents for support for those first few weeks. And that's been a big part of what I've done as a pediatrician, is getting to know the extended families. But I find the work really rewarding. I see what's working and not working for Oregon families. And that over the years has motivated me to run for office, because I want to influence families in a way beyond what I can accomplish in the exam room through policy. And then COVID hit. And I will say, as a physician, we've been, in a way, our whole careers kind of prepare us for this moment. Of course, no one's really prepared for COVID, but we've been prepared for thinking about what we do in a pandemic, what infectious disease means, how infectivity affects the rules we make and the cleansers we use. And I have been steeped in COVID since this all started, both as a professional, as a small business owner, and now as someone who wants to be a leader in Oregon. And I've already proposed a framework for what I see as, I'm calling it the Oregon Pandemic Recovery Act. I'm reaching out to scientists at OHSU. I'm reaching out to leaders in the state. I'm reaching out to constituents to figure out the best way that Oregon can come out of this stronger, safer, and more equitable. I really believe I am the leader that is needed for this time. I have a unique skill set that is really necessary for thinking about how we get through and get beyond this pandemic stronger and better than ever. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And Laura joined on. Laura, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi there, my name is Laurie Gunderson. I'm our Director of Public Interest and Accountability, which basically means that I oversee reporters in our newsroom and also serve on the editorial board.
Great.
Sorry
Nice
that I was late. You
No
guys
problem.
started right on time.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you, Lisa. Laurie, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're running?
Certainly. It's been my honor and privilege to be a policy advocate and problem solver and coalition builder in public policy venues for nearly 30 years. First as the executive director of the Oregon Commission for Women, and then as an advocate for public education and tax reform in Oregon. I've worked on a variety of issues across the spectrum, including gun violence protection, healthcare access, domestic violence laws, tax reform, and most recently was one of the key architects of the Student Success Act, which I consider to be the crowning glory of my career. I've worked in all sorts of venues with respect to legislatures, under control of Democrats, Republicans, a little of both, lots of different kinds of legislative sessions over the years. I've even been there when they've gone all the way into August a couple times, and been through 2 recessions and have helped the legislature consider all of their options as they coped with downturns in the past. And that's valuable experience, I believe, as we are moving forward into a shattered economy post-pandemic. I am running for this position because I was compelled to run, first of all, by the general political climate. not the least of which is the catastrophe in Washington, D.C., but also in terms of the deep partisan divide in Oregon's legislature as well, and the fact that we are losing 17 veteran legislators, at least. There may be an 18th one coming soon, who are taking a lot of historical memory and expertise out of the building with them. And I know that when a new person comes into an open seat, they need to be able to hit the ground running fast and be oriented. This is not a training wheels district. This district includes the vibrant downtown of Portland. We have had 2 majority leaders and a Ways and Means co-chair out of this area. This is a very important seat for the Oregon legislature. And so when I was approached to run, I contemplated it and decided that 30 years of experience could probably be very valuable to that legislative body, given all of the different pushes and pulls that they have been coping with well before we knew about this current COVID crisis. And now I think it's even more important that we have someone who can hit the ground running and be able to work across party lines and represent all of the various interests and concerns that will be needed to be represented as we consider policy going forward to rebuild Oregon.
Great, thank you very much. First question will go to you, Laurie, to answer first. And it's about the pandemic, of course, and just kind of what it's doing to the economy. No one really knows at this point how much the pandemic and the stay-home order are going to affect the state in terms of tax revenue, or how long and deeply this economic crisis is going to last. Can you give a couple ideas of what you think the legislature should do next to help individuals and businesses get through this crisis?
Yes. Well, I have been doing a lot of research on this because I think that the legislature needs to do more than just the $33 million they appropriated yesterday, though that was a welcome, good start on addressing some of the most urgent current needs. But we have 2 rainy day funds and an ending fund balance that put our total tappable reserves at about $2.4 billion. I think that the economists will tell us on May 20th that we probably have a hole that's somewhat larger than that, maybe around $3 billion in terms of our general fund lottery revenues available to finish the biennium as they had budgeted it. So we have to come up with other solutions in addition to using our reserve accounts. Yes, it's raining. Yes, rainy day funds need to be tapped, but there need to be other options explored as well to make sure that we are caring for our most vulnerable. One of the things that I've done is create for 2021, so somewhat out, an Oregon Epidemic Response Act, and you can find it on my webpage, that addresses all the ways that we can help folks, both in terms of the current crisis, but also in terms of taking the lessons learned from this pandemic so that we're not caught building the plane as we fly it in the future for the inevitable future big catastrophe, whether it be an earthquake or another pandemic or anything else. And that includes supports for first responders and frontline workers. It includes healthcare access expansions, including things like, you know, the shopping mall health clinics that don't allow anybody who is on public health care like Medicare or Medicaid or Oregon Health Plan to be seen, make that illegal. Equity-based educational and child care support so that we are making sure that what we do with education doesn't leave out the kids who are in the digital divide. Economic resilience plans, there's a long piece of that, and how the state and the local governments work together better in coordination on some of the most urgent needs. That plan is on my website, as I said, and you're welcome to take a look at it. What I would also like to say is we can't bond our way to a solution. We have a bonding authority limit that is set every biennium. The current one for this 2-year budget period is a total of $1.5 billion. And I've spoken with the economist who serves on the commission, the State Debt Policy Advisory Commission. Tim Dewey is his name. He's an economist at the University of Oregon. And he was explaining to me that it's very likely that that $1.5 billion debt limit is going to be reduced as a result of the inevitable downturn that we're taking. So we would not be able to bond to the tune of $4 billion a year to do anything, much less the plan that my opponent has put forth. It's simply illegal. It's not doable, and it would crash the economy. But there are things that we can do, and understanding state finance and the investment value of certain kinds of expenditures versus others is another piece. And I don't mean to be long-winded here, but let me just say this one last thing. The Oregon Education Association, for whom I've been employed for a long time, commissioned a study from Eco Northwest in the last recession to take a look at what investments in certain sectors versus others do to stimulate economic recovery. And it turned out that investments in both K-12 and higher ed have a 5-year cycle of return on investment and immediately stimulate the economies of Oregon. And by that I mean the local economies as well as the statewide, because in more than 50% of our communities, the school district is the largest employer. So when you invest in education, for example, you're not just investing in the long-term educational health of the students you're serving better, but you're investing in your local economy as well and stimulating a recovery of an economic nature. And I think that that's an important point as we think about how to build out of this pandemic in terms of the economic side, not the medical side, but the economic side. We need to make sure we're doing everything possible to make that recovery as rapid and resilient as possible.
Great, thank you very much. Lisa, would you, actually, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
sure.
Yes, thank you.
It's unknown just how much the pandemic and stay-home order will cost the state in tax revenue and how long and deeply the economic impacts will cut. Can you give a couple ideas of what you think the legislature should do next to help individuals and businesses get through this economic crisis?
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question. Thanks for repeating it. Yeah, we're at the beginning of a recession, which is a contraction of our economy. We've seen unemployment go from a record low of 3.3% to probably will be nearing 20%. We know that 300,000 Oregonians have filed for unemployment. It's pretty astounding. And we know that the Oregonians are really hurting, that we're having a hard time getting that money from the state unemployment or the state employment department into Oregonians' hands, and the Oregonian has covered that very nicely. So we need kind of immediate help for those people. I think you're right that the money that the legislature released for small business relief and for those on the front line and for hospitals is a small step, but we need to really try to fix the unemployment snafus quickly. I'm really looking at the long term. I do believe the 2021-2022 legislative session, for which this election is looking at, will be pretty much wholly focused on response and recovery to this pandemic. And although we don't know exactly how bad it's going to be, we know it's going to be very bad, and that we cannot have a fully functioning economy until we have significant herd immunity, which will be evidenced by serology, as well as a safe and effective vaccine that is widely used throughout the state. So some ideas I have put out bold ideas. Laurie is shooting holes in it. I hear ya. I think this is a time for very different thinking. We will need to legislate, legalize, Supreme Court get involved, doing things very different right now. This isn't time for status quo. This isn't time for business as usual. We have an opportunity here because we've seen the inequities and the cracks in our system, but we have an opportunity here to rebuild an Oregon that is safer, stronger, and more equitable than before. I know Metro is proposing a $4 billion bond for transportation. My gosh, can't we propose a bond that much for our state to take care of the most vulnerable, to rebuild our health system, to replenish our depleted PPEs, to fix those bridges as an employment program? I'm thinking really big, bold ideas. I envision something like a Marshall Plan where Oregon comes out of this, as I say, stronger, safer, and more equitable than before. It's out of the box thinking. It's a little crazy. It's a little nutty. Let's do it. Let's shoot for the stars and not be hogtied by what has or hasn't worked in the past. And I think it's time I don't think it's time for status quo thinking, for establishment. This is a once in a century challenge This is a once in a century threat to our lives and to our livelihoods. And we need once in a century solutions, not what we've been doing for 30 years. And that's why I think my fresh perspective, as well as my medical expertise, is exactly what this time in history needs. I don't know about House District 36 seat versus other seats. I'm saying in this time in our history, we need a fresh perspective and we need medical expertise.
So what would you do with that money?
So I mean, this is my dream. Yeah, this is my dream. Kind of thinking about what I call a Marshall Plan or WPA or Civilian Conservation Corps. We are not going to be back to full economic functionings. The jobs that have been lost, some of which are temporary, a lot of those are going to become permanent. We are not, I was thinking about Laurie and I had dinner at Joe Bar. That was awesome back in October. Joe Bar can't come back until we have full immunity, which is probably 15 months from now in a good time, right? We're not going to have people 6 feet apart in a restaurant and be able to make that work. So there are going to be jobs that don't come back because of the pandemic until we have full herd immunity. We're not going to have sports stadiums. We're not going to have things at the Moda Center. So there'll be a lot of people who need work. Let's put them to work fixing our bridges. Let's put them to work retrofitting our schools that are still dangerous. Let's put them to work, doing the neglected work that we have not been able to do now because of our economic constraints. I'm actually seeing us as putting people to work, and I want to build a world-class health system, a world-class education system. I want to improve our infrastructures in terms of our roads and our bridges, and more importantly, our mass transit. And I think this is, it's horrible that we're in this situation, but I think this provides us with opportunity.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see. This is, I mean, you talked about the bond. I guess I'm curious about, and I guess for this question, Lisa, you should start first on this. Revenue and how to increase revenue is going to be pretty vital. Okay, you talked about the bond. I guess I'm wondering if there are any other changes to Oregon's tax system, since the bond would be, you'd still need to pay that back. What changes to Oregon's tax system would you support to bring in more revenue or bring it from different sources?
I think that's a really tough answer, because we are going to see a decline in revenue among all sectors. I will say, as a small business owner, that we are certainly have a massive decrease in our revenue, because we had to do the right thing by changing entirely how we do things in my clinic. We see clinics going out of business, clinics who've been in business for 50, 60 years. Sure, some of that will come back, but not all of it will. I think there are probably some tweaks we can do to the tax code. I certainly think we need to get rid of the kicker. I think it's totally reasonable to think about getting rid of the mortgage interest tax deduction. Those are some things that come to mind first, but I don't think we can tax ourselves out of this, in large part because so many revenues and incomes are going to be going down. So taxes on that money will also be going down. But those are some things to think about.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself.
Yeah.
And Laurie, what about you? What, if any, changes to Oregon's tax system would you support to bring in more revenue?
Right. Well, the first thing I would do is take a look at the tax code with respect to the giveaways that we already have on the books. We have 358 or 368 tax expenditures, some of which are good public policy, some of which are there because of good lobbyists, to be honest. And there are some that favor the affluent at the expense of all the rest of us. And while one could argue whether or not those ought to exist at any moment in time, at least during the recovery period, especially if we're going to be cutting services to agencies that help our most vulnerable, I think it's fair to ask that we also make sure that we at least pause those tax breaks for the wealthy and corporations that are doing well, even in the pandemic or its aftermath. And that's a good place to start. There are hundreds of millions of dollars to be harvested there. The one that, forgive me, Lisa, I'm going to say it again. You've heard me say it before, that I think is a particularly colossally unfair one is the state pass-through tax break, which some have dubbed the suits and scrubs tax break. It was originally meant for small businesses to help them, especially when struggling, an objective I support. But what it's turned out to be is a preferential low tax rate on income for primarily lawyers and doctors. And it just doesn't seem to me that that is defensible, I would argue, ever, but certainly not during the pandemic. We're in the recovery period. And I would certainly consider that low-hanging fruit to go after that. These are just examples. There are many more. So start with the tax expenditure book that is produced along with the governor's budget every biennium. And I've gotten to know it very well over the years as something of a tax policy geek. But in addition, I would argue that it might be time for a temporary assessment at the high end, maybe what some people have called the millionaire's tax. I think I'd be more amenable to it as an experiment to get us out of the recession, a little like Measure 67 that was done for 4 years back in the last recession, so that we are able to raise only those revenues that are essential for economic recovery and services to our neediest citizens and for our public education system. Look, our general fund basically does three things. We educate, we medicate, we incarcerate, right? So that's 95% of the budget. And if we are facing as much as a 10% hole, which some are talking about, we need to figure out creative ways, temporary ways, but creative ways to raise revenues. We don't need to get fancy. We don't need to break the Constitution or the laws. What we need to do is go for the things that we know that we can achieve and find consensus among all to accomplish, to keep the trains running on time.
Great. And Laurie, this question will go to you first. You know, kind of again along the lines of looking at the revenue picture and what that's able to fund. What philosophy or concepts do you think should guide the legislature in developing its next budget? For instance, what priorities should it put first, and what needs can, you know, take a back seat?
I think we need to consider the people first. I care very much about our first responders, our nurses, our firefighters, our teachers, our grocery line workers. The grocery line is the front line. The folks who are essential workers right now doing the important and essential work of our communities, even though they put themselves at risk to do it. I think about the working families in general who are put on pause in terms of their own livelihoods and their struggles to make ends meet. I want to make sure that we have all the resources and capacity in place to address that emergency in a way that keeps people as whole as possible. And then I want to work on long-term resilience for our economy so that our working families are able to thrive. We had a lot of people who did not share in Oregon's prosperity before the pandemic. And everyone knows this. We have a houselessness problem. We have hunger. We have lack of access to higher education. We've had all sorts of problems that showed the economic inequality, both in terms of earnings and wealth, and the haves and the have-nots. And that gap has only grown wider. And it's one of my fundamental concerns. So that will guide the kinds of policies I will choose as the next representative from this district.
And are there any things that you would, anything that comes to mind that you think should take a back seat or should be, you know, a lower priority?
Well, sure. I think in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we always work on the things that are most essential first and then work downwards. So I've stated a few. I consider both our budget and our revenue code to be moral documents. And what we prioritize as a people is what we enact in terms of how we fund things and in terms of how we address tax policy. And those are the two powerful ways to make policy. It's not just the words on the page in terms of the statutes. It's also how we allocate money and to whom. And I will be guided by those things that are most essential in making those kinds of judgments.
Okay. Lisa, the question is basically just understanding that the revenue picture is going to look very different. What philosophy or concepts should guide the legislature in developing its next budget? And if you can specify some priorities for what you think needs to be, a top focus versus others that you think can wait.
Great, thank you. Yes, absolutely. We need a much stronger safety net. I think we saw that the pandemic really unearthed that what we all knew, right? We knew in the December 2019 report on Multnomah County that a third of Multnomah County residents do not make enough money to meet their basic needs, which is housing, healthcare, childcare, and transportation and food. And so we know there are a lot of people that were really just right on the margin, and this pandemic has pushed them over. So we need to absolutely strengthen the safety net with long-term rent assistance, more affordable housing. So I think housing is fundamental. Healthcare is fundamental. Thank you, Laurie, for saying, one of the three things the state does is provide healthcare for people. We know that healthcare historically has been about 27% of Oregon's budget. We know that that percentage is going to go up because costs are way up in COVID and revenue is down. And I will just do it, we have very few healthcare experts in the legislature. And it's just one more place where I think my expertise is needed, because the budget is such a big part of it is delivery of healthcare. So we need to make sure everyone has access to healthcare and true access to healthcare. We know it's not just about having insurance because of high deductibles, and people are not seeking access to health. I'm particularly concerned about the Latinx population. It's a big part of my practice. I speak Spanish, so I get a lot of Latinx families in my practice. And the divide we're seeing there, both in the achievement gap among the students in those families, as well as the fact that they are getting sick and dying at higher rates from COVID than we're seeing among the white community. So we need to figure out how to help the health of every Oregonian and elevate the health of every Oregonian. So I would say my priorities would really be strengthening the safety net, elevate the health of every Oregonian, and there's a lot of different ideas on how to do that. And of course, make sure that education is accessible for every Oregonian. I am concerned that I think we have to be honest, there's a chance that we won't be back in the classrooms on September 1st or whatever the date is. We absolutely have to make sure that technology is available to those students. So yes, things are going to have to take a back seat in this once in a century downturn in our economy and threat to our health. I am, I'll be honest, global warming is an existential threat to all of us. I'm not seeing us actually getting tons of action done on that, certainly in 2021, because we're going to be 100% focused on what we need to do to get as many Oregonians back to work, to make sure everyone has access to healthcare, and to make sure everyone has access to education.
That actually goes right into a question that I had, and I'll ask this, which you've already answered, but since you're first, would you support moving forward with a cap and trade program in the 2021 session?
I would say it's naive to think that we have bandwidth, time, money, resources for that right now. I think 2021 has to be 100% about the recovery from the recession, if not the depression. And unfortunately, I think that is one of the things that will have to be delayed for the third year in a row. And that's a disappointment, but that I think is the reality right now.
Okay, great. And Laurie, the same question for you. Would you support moving forward with a cap and trade program in the 2021 session?
I think that there are elements of the Cap and Invest program that could be integrated with a resiliency recovery program. I don't think that the legislature is unable to both walk and chew gum, but it will have to be done carefully. I take the point that there is so much to do in terms of both immediate needs and long-term rebuilding that will take a lot of bandwidth and energy. But I also think that the Cap and Invest program was very thoughtful in terms of considering economic resiliency for especially communities that would have to transition out of their traditional way of doing business. And we could probably borrow from a lot of the legislation in House Bill 2020 or its successor for the 2020 session 1535, I think it was, and integrate the goals of the Cap and Invest program into the resiliency build-out program that we'll have to be looking at in our economic recovery. I wouldn't at least pencil it out. I think that the graver danger to that has to do with the partisanship and the weaponizing of the quorum rules that happened twice now. I think that unless we have a resolution to the mechanics of how that all works, is going to continue to block good solutions to all kinds of programs and problems that we're trying to solve.
So you cast this as sort of like, the legislature being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Certainly the cap and trade program, especially for the reasons you note about the objections from Republicans that caused them to walk out, that's a pretty significant piece of controversial legislation. So I guess
right.
You talked about the goals. Are there other pieces that you think would easily fit into a resilience plan that would not trigger the kind of partisan fight that would potentially derail yet another legislative session?
I think that the pieces that focus on job transitions and green economy, infrastructure investment, in other words, creating jobs. Could we create something, for example, located in a rural area to build Oregon-made electric cars or other kinds of energy infrastructure products? Is there a way to think anew about the kinds of new uses of technology that would enable us to be greener and also therefore cornering the market more resilient economically, because we'd be creating jobs and creating commerce out of nothing, and in areas that have been in traditionally much graver economic downfall, even during our highest soaring years with low unemployment overall statewide. I'm thinking Coos Bay, I'm thinking far eastern Oregon, I'm thinking places where we have workforce that would love to come to the table. Are there ways to specifically pluck out the elements from the bill that would aid and abet our economic growth program?
So would you decouple? Oh, I'm sorry. Would you decouple that from the funding mechanism, which was capping fossil, or the gas? Sorry, there was the fuel. Okay, I'm sorry. It's been a long day. So in terms of the funding for the green jobs training, clean energy jobs, it would rely on increases in fuel costs depending on what region, and then part of that would go to fund job training. Also in terms of I guess what I'm wondering is, would you take out that element? I mean, would you look for funding other than capping fossil fuel emissions and to fund that kind of job retraining? Because I agree, I don't think that would be controversial, but I don't think that was so much the controversial part of it, but it was also what was necessary to actually pay for it.
True. And I guess what I'm saying is, right now I'm kind of thinking out loud, and would need a lot more expertise around the table. And that's what I'm good at. I'm good at bringing people to a table who are all over the various different positions on issues and bringing them together to problem solve. That's my secret sauce in my 30-year career. And so I pulled that piece out as a for instance. But here we have gas prices that are about the cost of a can of beer, right? I mean, we might be able to do that piece to fund the green energy jobs piece. I think we need to look at the entire landscape, maybe pull the pieces and parts apart and scale them or step them in approach. Maybe in this biennium we do this much. Maybe we add this in the second biennium and do a phase in. I'm thinking off the top of my head because it is not my area of fundamental expertise, but what I am good at is finding a way to pull things apart and rebuild them again to try to find a way to derive consensus. And sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes the entire strategy is not going to go anywhere, and we won't know until we try. But I think that if there's a way to take a look at that program as much as possible, part of our rebuild solution, I think we're going to have at least an opportunity to have a conversation again. Right now, no one's talking to each other on this issue. And this is how you make law, is that you sit people down and say, is there another way to approach this? And ask some leading questions that get them to think about it a different way.
And Laurie, you'll be first on this, and you actually referenced this. It was Republicans walked out of both the Senate and the House last session. Republicans in the Senate walked out also twice the previous year. What would you support to, I guess, what mechanisms or changes would you support to prevent that from happening again?
We have to do one of two things. Either we have to change the rules so that they can't be used as a way to have a super minority ruling the roost, or we have to have consequences for the choice they make to walk out that are significant. Right now, I find it very offensive that someone can walk off the job and not only get their regular pay for the job, irrespective of their actions, but their per diem on top of it. Per diem is explicitly to cover the expenses of being there in Salem to do the job. So it is truly offensive, more in terms of the principle than the money, to take your per diem for not being there to have those costs incurred. And so at the very least, that should be done. I think, though, that one of the easiest ways to take the running down the clock strategy out of this game is by defining a day for the purpose of legislative days length of a session as a session day. And if you define it as a session day, it includes days in which you have a quorum. So you embed the quorum in the definition of a day, and then you take the gamesmanship out of it. You'll never take controversy and disagreement over policy out of the building. But what can you do to make it an honest conversation rather than a chess game?
Great, thank you. And Lisa, same question for you, I guess, kind of knowing that there were walkouts this past session and last year as well. What steps would you take to try to prevent that from happening again?
Thank you. I do just want to say that part of my Oregon Pandemic Recovery Act, when I talked about building infrastructure, was definitely about building green jobs across the state. So I have been thinking about this, Laurie. That was off the top of your head, but it was out of my playbook, and I'm grateful. You're welcome to borrow it. I will say, in terms of the walkouts, obviously it's very disappointing as someone who worked on the vaccine bill and the gun bill of 2019 and 2020 that would require safe storage. It was very disappointing. So I agree there needs to be some thoughts on rule change. I think that idea of defining a session as a day or a day as a session is compelling. I know that there was going to be a ballot measure that would restrict people from running for re-election if they missed a certain number of days in session. I don't know if that's going to make it on the ballot. I know it's a very challenging time to be collecting signatures. Yeah, Laurie says no. So I think there's things around that. But I will say, I just have to say, as a physician, I walk into rooms and I have to make a connection with who's ever on the other side of that door. And it's a little bit easier as a pediatrician because we share such a common goal of the child in the room. You know, is my child sick, Dr. Reynolds? How much longer will she be sick? Is it, if she's only saying this many words, do we need to worry? And I think I will bring that same kind of professional listening and pretty quick connection to the legislature that I think my opponent doesn't share. I mean, her crowning achievement, which I am a strong supporter of, had not a single Republican vote. I think that I come in there with a little bit more of a clean slate in terms of what the Republicans will expect out of the legislator from House District 36. But to move back a little bit, I would say that we either need to think about a rule change or we need to do much more mending of fences with our Republican colleagues. And I am hopeful that given that, you know, just like in the exam room, we have the shared concern of that child in the exam room, we are going to have a very, very many shared concerns about where Oregon is when the legislature convenes in February 1st or whatever the date is, February 1st of 2021. And I am very convinced that we will be able to work together in a way that we haven't been able to in the last few years. Tragedies do bring people together, and I'm really hopeful that that Oregon's greatest days and its greatest legislative achievements are ahead of us.
Great. Laura, did you have a question?
Well, I was just going to say that I also was the person who brought family medical leave to Oregon, and that was when the Republicans were in charge. I have done many public policy pieces over the years that have won bipartisan support, and some of them very challenging. So that wasn't a fair shot.
So I'm sorry, I meant to, and yes, you, the two of you should feel free to jump in. I know that Laurie Gunderson also has a question, so I want to kind of give her an opportunity to. I knew I was going to stumble at some point with Lisa and Laurie and Laura, and so.
Yeah, I have a question, and I believe, Helen, you're so good at tracking. This one would go to Laurie first, correct?
I can't remember anymore.
Actually,
no, I think it goes to Lisa.
Yeah.
Thank you. Basically, I should just, whatever I think it should go, I should say the other thing because I always get it wrong. So Lisa, I'm curious. Analysts have warned that the legislature's decision to delay repayment of Oregon pension system's $25 billion unfunded liability would put the fund at greater risk in the event of a recession. Well, here we are. Stocks have plummeted and we are almost certainly in a recession now. What, if anything, do you think we should do to tackle this public finance crisis moving forward?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And again, I will be referring to the Oregonian coverage of this. I was really happy to read that the Oregon Treasury has actually done a better job in investing our PERS dollars than we've seen in other states. And while we've had obviously losses in the PERS fund due to the economic downturn, it was invested in less risky stocks than we've seen certainly in other states. And we've all personally seen, you know, my personal retirement fund has certainly taken quite a hit right now, and I'm hoping to see the recovery soon. But I will say, I will just go on record, as I've said before, I don't believe we should be cutting PERS benefits to our workers to balance what has been, you know, maybe some inappropriate management in the past. And I will say, if there comes a time when it seems that that sacrifice has to be made, it can only be made with the agreement of the workers. And I've also said, hey, if we're going to do anything where we're realigning or rethinking PERS payments, we absolutely have to find compensatory increase in wages or benefits. And again, with workers, you know, thumbs up on that. So that's where I stand on that. I think did I answer your question correctly, Laura?
Yeah, I guess I just, if you don't see a place for kind of pension reform, bringing up the fact that the only way you'd get this passed is if you could get the employees on board, what would be a solution to tackle this? Because recall, if not addressed, this money comes from somewhere. It comes from our classrooms. Right. It comes from the social services we provide. So how do we fix this then?
I am not going to be able to provide a fix. As you know, hundreds of people before me have worked on a variety of fixes, and nothing has felt tenable. So I don't feel that, I will say this is one area I do not have the expertise on how we're going to fix the PERS system, which has been a concern and a problem for decades. But I will say one thing I would not be interested in doing, and that would be cutting the benefits.
And Laura, would you like me to read the question over again, or?
I think I understand it pretty well. Yeah. We've all been working on it for a long time. One of the things that I think we need to keep in mind is that if we replace $1 of benefit with $1 of salary, the cost is $1.33. So I caution against that, right? Because you have payroll costs associated with it, which is how we ended up with a decent benefit in the beginning, because years and years and years ago, someone decided that giving benefits cost them $1, whereas giving them a salary increase cost $1.33 or thereabouts. what should have happened, of course, back then is that extra 33 cents should have been put in some sort of long-term reserve, but we can't put the genie back in the bottle. So I have a little bit different approach. And this is just an idea as a starting point. We need to depoliticize this. Right now, the way the problem gets framed in terms of the legacy tier 1 costs and the unfunded actuarial liability, and the way it impacts the costs to school districts or local governments or state agencies, is that we're pitting caseworkers against their foster children or teachers against their students. And what that does is it turns it into a political problem first and a fiscal problem second. I want to get rid of the politics of that seems so unfair. And I think that we should take the legacy tier 1 costs out of the local governments and state government liabilities, make it a general fund line item where we can deal with it in a much more honest way. And that might be in the form of some kind of bonding or re-amortization program. It might be some other kind of funding or financing program, but we've got a 15-year time horizon, according to the actuaries, where this is really our crisis. But we have to also be very careful that anything that we do that would just run off anybody eligible to retire, considering the graying of Oregon and how old most of our workers are in a lot of our public service professions, we don't want to drive them into retirement prematurely, or then the liability becomes due and payable, right? So it makes sense to think about this both in short and long-term ways by taking the politics out of it first. And then I think if, as a general fund line item, we're going to be able to deal with the problem a lot more honestly. Again, there may be people in the Treasurer's Office and the Oregon Investment Council and so on who have thoughts about investment instruments that we could turn to maybe buy that down more quickly. And I agree with Lisa on this. They say that ours is the 5th best retirement system of all states out of 50, which makes me worried about the other 45. But but it is a little bit of good news. And so again, if we can depoliticize it and focus on a fiscal remedy and use our experts on the deployment of fiscal instruments, I think we're going to be able to finally tackle this thing. And yes, having everybody at the table makes sense. Of course, you'll hear me say that on any problem that the state has to tackle. If it were easy, we would have had a fix a long time ago. And certainly we've tried various different measures.
I guess just on follow-up real quick though, you had raised what appeared to be valid concerns about bonding moving forward in terms of where Oregon will be, and then also just kind of what tax implications that would have for Oregon citizens. So are there any other ways that you see that, because there have to be revenues to cover these needs.
Sure.
So if bonding isn't on the table because we're in a different place as we come out of this, realistically, how do we move forward?
Well, I think that it is going to be a revenue question, no doubt. We're going to have to do business differently in just every fathomable way, as individuals, as a state, as a nation. And I do believe that the ways we have structured, I'm going to go back to this, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but the ways we have structured our revenue policies seem to me upside down. And there may be some elements of a partial fix there. I think we're going to have to diversify our solutions. And 1049, the Senate bill in 2019 that did pass, did some of that. There were parts of that bill I thought were really good that looked at smaller pots of money and deployed those for buying down the unfunded actuarial liability. I think only one part of that was really controversial and probably unconstitutional. We'll see. But there have been many little bits and pieces we've patchworked together to come up with partial solutions. And I think we need to keep thinking outside the box there. But in order to get to the final solution, and you're right, just like the unfunded actuarial liability was created, at least in large measure, by the stock market crashes of the 2000s, not the employee benefit itself.
Wait, I'm sorry, you think actually that So you don't think that there is a structural problem with the way Tier 1 benefits were structured with either the money
Oh, I didn't
match or
say
the,
that. What I said is that the unfunded actuarial liability for Tier 1 exploded as a result of those investment losses.
well, it exposed, I mean, the crash exposed the unsustainability of the structure. It, you know, I'm sure that you and I will would go back and forth on that, but, you know, in our view, that's very much a myth, this idea that the recession is what caused the unfunded actuarial, I can't say it either, the liability, because it was basically that you had this structural problem, which I don't hear anyone defending the decisions made for the promises made to Tier 1 as being a responsible or sustainable program.
Well, I think I did say that back in the day, that $1 of salary cost $1.33 and a benefit was a cheaper option. But what they should have done then is take the difference between the two and create a reserve that made that a more sustainable promise to make. And we can't go backwards. And
right.
I did say that right at the front of my answer. So
right. But there were, okay, sorry, I just wanted to push back on this idea that that it was the stock market crash or the recession in 2008 that caused this. I mean, this is very clearly a structural problem that was built into the PERS system for Tier 1 and that has been changed. And I think we would absolutely agree that in terms of the response, the unfunded liability, Tier 3 accounts for a tiny, tiny sliver of it. But the,
sure.
okay, great. I do want to ask one more question, and that's about Oregon's educational system. And I believe this goes to you first, Laurie. You know, as you know, Oregon's graduation system has been known for years for a low graduation rate and high chronic absenteeism. It's had limited success in closing the achievement gap between historically underserved students and white students. Recognizing that education funding is in peril, I guess I'm wondering what other suggestions or ideas should the state be looking at to help close the achievement gap or improve the prospects for Oregon students? And connected with this, which I know is becoming a very long question, would you have any, there's been talk about delaying the corporate activity tax. Is that something that you would consider at all?
I'm going to start with the last question first because it's the easiest, quickest. The answer is no, and here's why. First of all, the structure of the corporate activities tax was explicitly designed so that those who actually had revenues to pay it would be the ones who paid it. And that was in our, before the pandemic, fewer than 10% of businesses operating in Oregon. It'll be a smaller percentage now. But those that don't have that resource coming in won't have to pay it. There will be no penalty, according to the Department of Revenue, for late payments, even though it's supposed to be paid quarterly. Their actual liability won't be due till April of 2021. So no, I don't think that there's a reason for delaying it. Look, Amazon made $24 billion just during the COVID epidemic in 1 month's time. Should they not pay their CAT? That's just ridiculous. This is going to hurt students, and the very students that the first part of your question addresses, the equity issues. I was one of the architects of the Student Success Act, and I can tell you how proud I am that we focused that explicitly on our traditionally underserved students, whether it's high poverty students because of race or ethnicity who felt underserved, whether it's English language learners, students who are cognitively or otherwise disabled, pregnant and parenting, homeless, foster kids. These are the kids that we have had the greatest difficulty of offering an equitable education to, and that this money was designed to help. So that would be very counterproductive to back it out for those who still can pay it. Now, when it comes to the indicators of how you judge what success looks like, high stakes testing and graduation rates and a lot of those indicators that are easy grab and go data don't necessarily tell the whole story of what our students are experiencing. 52% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch. We have the highest rate of houseless youth in the nation. We have kids in poverty or at or near the poverty line that are the majority of our students in our schools. And every good education researcher will tell you that there is a correlation between family socioeconomic status and achievement in school. So what is it that we can do to make sure that those kids who for one reason or another are most likely to struggle in schools are able to cross the finish line successfully along with their more affluent peers? Well, we've got to have better pre-K programs and the language learning that comes with that, that'll help give kids a good start when they're 5-year-olds coming into kindergarten. We need to make sure we have summer school programs so that they can compete and not have the learning loss over the summer. But to look at the dropout rates, I know my friend Betsy Hammond and I will have arguments till the end of time on this, but when you have 50 states with 50 different sets of standards for what constitutes an adequate education in order to award a diploma, and we have one of the highest Carnegie units required, 24, plus the 6 essential skills, plus the big statewide test. We are very rigorous in terms of what we expect for students to get that diploma, and we also keep very honest, good records. The state of Texas, and you can Google this, will often just take a 15-year-old who drops out and mark them as somebody who's decided to choose homeschooling instead. That's not honest, but it's done, and they've gotten caught for it. But so a state-by-state comparison of dropout rates, for example, is not a very good measure of quality. I'd rather look at the status of our students and what it is they are navigating and address those issues. And by the way, the Student Success Act does just that.
Great. I think I know the question. If I missed something, let me know. Well, look, we absolutely want to have 100% of our students, graduate from high school. I don't think anyone would argue with that. And 80% is short of where we want to be, although we have seen improvement, and I'm grateful for that. But absolutely, make no mistake about it. We want 100% high school graduation rate. And I will use what Laurie referred to as a pediatrician. I am an expert in those first 2,000 days of life. That's kind of 0 to 5 roughly. I know that so much that happens in those years actually influence high school graduation rates. And I agree that we should have, I'm arguing for universal pre-K. I know Multnomah County is going to look at that on the November ballot. I think we need universal pre-K for the whole state. I remember the days when kindergarten was half day long, and that didn't make sense to me when I moved here, and I'm glad that was fixed. So I think we need universal pre-K. I think we need trauma-informed care, especially in those pre-K years when kids may be struggling with issues that happen in their home lives that, if aren't addressed appropriately early on, can become long-term mental health challenges. So I'm all about having that kindergartner start as ready as possible. We know that translates into higher 3rd grade reading scores and high school graduation, which we know is necessary but not sufficient for ultimate kind of rewarding job satisfaction or further education. So absolutely, 100% high school graduation rate. That needs to be our guiding star. And other ways we can get there besides, I think, doing the work on those early end, what I call upstream work, and those very precious first years of life, is the support that I think Laurie's talking about. But as tremendous a support as we can give for those kids who are falling behind, and closing that achievement gap. What I see in my practice every day is the 9th grader. That is, I think 9th grade has to be one of the most vulnerable ages for young people. It's kind of where they figure out, how much can I advocate for myself? My mom's probably a little bit less involved with what's going on in 9th grade than she was in middle school, or maybe my mom wasn't involved at all, but this is where I'm really starting to slip. So I think we need to do peer modeling and adult mentors, tagged to every 9th grader in every high school across the state. That would be awesome. I think that would be great to raise high school rates. We look at programs where that's been successful. I think Wilsonville, oh my God, I can't remember the school where it's been particularly successful, where there's mentorships, both with upperclassmen and faculty, where there's small groups. I think programs like that are really important, but I would for sure want to really look at that 0 to 5. So those are my thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you very much. Laura, did you have anything else?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time today.
Thank you.
Like a little closing statement or something?
If you guys want to do it, it's got to make it pretty quick, but sure. And actually, since I guess, why don't you go first?
Okay, since I brought it up, yeah. Just a few more things I just want to add, because in my opening I talked about being an activist. And I'm really proud of my work as an activist. I was a volunteer with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense and became a lead in that organization for years, where I helped train and recruit hundreds of Oregonians to come to the legislature and to testify and to fill hearing rooms and to meet with their legislators. So I wanted to talk about that because it certainly gave me that firsthand view of the power of what we can do in Salem. And I'm really, really grateful for that. I'm a founder of Indivisible Oregon. We founded it on New Year's Day, 2017. What was that, 8 weeks after the election and a few weeks before the inauguration. But I just want to go back to that. I think these are the times that, try men's souls. I'm really serious, and women's. And I think at this time, we need a legislator with keen knowledge of virology, of vaccine, of how to do a vaccine movement, how to do a vaccine clinic. What we need to do, I think we need, one thing I didn't say earlier, we need to stockpile some money so we can be the first state to be fully vaccinated. I am someone whose campaign is 94% of my dollars were raised by friends and family and people I met on the doors. One of my biggest volunteers right now is someone whose door I knocked and met for the first time in November. This is a grassroots campaign where I'm beholden to my constituents and to Oregonians. I don't think it's time for a Salem insider. Salem has plenty of insiders by definition. I think it's time for new, bold thinking with the expertise on medicine that is sorely lacking in Salem. So thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you. Laurie, do you want to give any closing thoughts?
Sure, I do. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks also for that great conversation we've had today. I work across the aisle. I love to put together strange bedfellow coalitions. That's my specialty. And I've been an unapologetic progressive who understands my own values and that of those who I represent. But I would never say that I'm an insider. What I am is a person who's a pragmatic problem solver. I consider myself a values candidate, and I have independent thinking that comes to the table with me every day that I go to work. That I believe that I'm a good fit for House District 36, having been out there on those doorsteps or on the telephone with them for 8 months now. This is one of the most progressive districts in the state, and I'm a good fit for that district. But there are 4 of us in this race who all are on the Democratic side of the aisle, and all would be reasonable choices if that were all that we were to consider. The difference, the defining difference in this race is not one of ideology. It is one of capability. And my opponent has one set of skills that I honor and admire very much, but it isn't the same thing as understanding how to make sure that we can get agreement on an important public policy piece. And I have been doing that for 30 years, and I have some great wins to my name, as I said, in all sorts of policy leadership dynamics, whether we have a 30-30 House or Senate, whether we have Republicans in charge or one chamber in one hand and one in the other. What I bring to the table is the ability to pull people together and extract their best thinking and create public policy that is not wild, that takes into account and honors the process we have ahead of us and what instruments and levers we have at our disposal, and is realistic and measured, but also dream big within the parameters of what the citizens of Oregon expect us to do as responsible leaders. That's what I bring to the table. That's why I was asked to run. And that's why I consider it an honor to serve, but I consider myself to be a competent choice for this office.
Great. Thank you both so much for this conversation. We really appreciate the time you spent. We'll be coming out with our endorsements in the legislative races probably a week from this coming Wednesday. Yeah, a week from this coming Wednesday is I think what we're targeting. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
weekend.